Yeah, so today the topic is two core areas that we believe are quite essential to manage models. And those are versioning and effectivity. So those are the two topics I'm going to talk about today. And I will show you how our modeling environment called ACE is implementing both of those. What we deal with here is configurable products. I hope and expect that people are aware what that is. Those are the configuration models that are the basis for creating configurators. And when we talk about products in this context, it might be relevant to notice that it doesn't have to be a physical product, but it can also be a service contract or a legal contract or things like that. So product models is what we're going to talk about today. They are basically an abstraction on top of the parts and builds and materials that goes into the physical product. They consist basically of two things: a set of features. Those are things like color, size. In this case, there's a little example of a bicycle. We have a color, we have a region, the material, and the warranty. And we have the other part of the product model is the rules that goes into it. And in this case, we have two very simple rules talking about different constraints on the material. If it's aluminum, then you cannot get the blue color and things like that. And of course, this is a toy example. In real life, these models are really large. They consist of thousands of rules and features, and they are changing over time. So that's basically what I will address today is how do we manage data like that in an efficient way. So the core concept of versioning is not a new thing. We know this from many different contexts. We know it from documents. We know it from parts in a PLM system. It's a pretty standard concept that you need because things are changing over time. And by having a concept of a version, you can control how this change happens. So basically, you add new versions with the changes. And these changes are, of course, due to new features being introduced. It's due to things are changing, due to differences in the environment, can be legal requirements. They can also change just because we did a mistake in the old version, and now we need to fix that mistake and create a new version with that change in it. The versions basically allows us to have some notion of traceability. It allows you to understand the previous version. You can go back in time, and you can understand who changed what and when. But it's also, and I'll show you this in a moment, it's also a basis for doing collaboration. If you don't have a notion of versions, it's very, very difficult to have multiple people working on the same data at the same point in time. One thing that's important to notice is that when you talk about product models, it's not just that you can version each individual in itself. You have to look at the collection of all the rules and all the features and associated information such as translations and images and stuff like that. You have to look at that as a whole, and it has to be all consistent. So versioning goes very much across all the entities that we work with. The way we have approached versioning is very much inspired by how versioning is done in software. We came with a software background. We have done software versioning for a long time, and there is a very well-established way to manage software revisioning over time. And there's the most predominant software versioning control system is called Git. There are many others out there. They all base the way of doing versioning by a notion of having branches. So the picture on the right here illustrates how there is a master branch, and then you can branch out of that, and you can develop sort of or have different versions of that master branch. And there might be one you call develop, and you do some changes, and you can split up again and create yet another branch, and then at some point you merge those changes back into the branch, and that's basically how software is being developed. And we have adapted that exact same approach in our modeling environment. So if you go to our ACE application, you'll see that basically you have a notion of a master branch. And whenever you want to do any types of changes, you cannot edit anything in master. You have to create what we call a work item. And within that work item, you do all the changes and you do your work. And when you've done, you take your collected set of changes and what we call promote them back into master. So the benefit of this is that you get your own isolated copy of everything in master. You can do all your changes, you can do test and validation, and nobody will see those changes as long as they are in this work item. So a way to illustrate this, here we have the master branch going in the middle, and you can see that there's a green work item that has been created at this point in time. I'm pointing in the wrong place here. Here there's a branch out, and we get a green work item. Later there's a purple one coming in here, and then there's a red one coming in here. So these three work items are all concurrent, and we can have separate groups of people working on the data in each one of them. Then we promote the green one, and we get the green changes introduced into master. And those green changes we can pull into the red work item to update it with the most recent changes. That's called a rebase or an update. And then we do the same thing with the purple. And then at some point we promote also the red one, and we get that change effect in here. So that's basically how we work with versions in ACE. What's pretty cool is that you get, when you do this branch, you get a copy of the entire database. That's the way to think of it. Of course, in real implementation, you don't actually copy the database. You do the whole database is versioned. All the records have version information, but that's how it feels for the user that he gets this copy. So let's see how this would work in ACE. Here is a scenario where we have our model, and we would like to introduce a new color, this nice pink color. And how would we do this in ACE? Well, we would basically create a work item. We will add this color to the list of colors, so extend the features, color features here. We will update the rules maybe, and we'll test the changes. All of this is done in isolation, so we will test and validate that whatever we've done is correct. And then we will finally promote those changes to our master branch. That's how we would work with a change like this. And the way it would look like in ACE is that here we have the work item. I called it introduce pink color, and I can go in this work item. I can see, it's work item 4, by the way. I can see the changes that has happened already in the work item. So in this case, apparently I have already done something to our library. I have already done something to the added the feature, and I have also apparently changed a rule. And I can click on each of these little details, and it will bring forward all the details of all the changes that have done. So I have a full traceability of what was changed in this work item. So for example, this rule here has changed from this text to some other text. Once I have promoted it, this group of changes to our master branch, I can also, in the master branch, when I'm here, go to the rule, and of course, I can view the history of that rule. So I can, within the master branch, I can see all the changes that led to this particular version that I'm looking at right here. And the way that looks like, in this case, there's only 2 work items that has led to this version, but this could be multiple work items. And for each one of them, I will be able to see who changed it, when was it changed, and the work item typically will have a reference back to the original change order that was asking for that change. So I have full traceability of the changes. If we go in master and look at that, we can also see how these sequence of work items that led to a particular state that we have. So each of these promotes of a complete work item is becoming part of the history of the system, and I can open each of these up. Oops, I didn't have that actually. But each of these work items, I can open it up and I can see the changes that was introduced in that work item. So I have the full history of my master branch as well. So one of the challenges, of course, when you do it this way is that you can run into what we call a merge conflict. So this is basically the situation where there are several work items that have changed the same piece of data. And when that happens, you get into what's called a conflict. And when you do traditional software development, the conflicts are text files, are 2 text files that have changes that you need to resolve. And it's pretty straightforward to sort of understand that there's chunks in the text file that you need to compare and find out what to do about. But here we're really talking about many sort of interlinked objects in a database. So here we need to have more support in the user interface to deal with this. And ACE supports this as part of the promotion. So in this case, we have an example where we have a rule, and it has changed in 2 different ways, in the green and in the purple work item. So the green here and the purple here, they each change the same rule, but they change it to something different. So the problem, of course, rises when this purple, the green one, the first guy, he gets to win, and he got his changes in the master branch. But when the purple guy wants to promote his changes, the system will basically tell him that he has to pick which one of the 2 versions that he has to promote. So this is done, of course, on any data object in the system. So this was versioning, and this is a fairly fundamental concept, because it allows you to track changes back in time. The other concept I want to talk about is called effectivity, and it's a fairly well-known concept. If you go to aerospace and automotive, they have dealt with effectivity for a long time. It's not so well used in product models, at least when it comes to other types of industries. But it's a very powerful concept. It allows you to specify when a change should happen in time. So it's basically a matter of specifying that this change that I'm putting into the system, it shouldn't happen immediately, but it might have to wait until a certain point in time. So it could, for example, be that so the typical use case is that you use it to phase features in and out. So you basically can specify that a feature or a rule or some other piece of information, it shouldn't be active until a certain point in time. So let me show you how that looks like. So again, we're back to our pink color, but let's assume that it shouldn't be introduced until this date. So we want to put it into the system today, now, because we know it's going to be a feature that we would like to offer. We would like to understand maybe also the consequences of adding this feature. It might be that we need to do some bill of material work. It might mean that we need to introduce pricing. We might need a new picture on our website. All these things we need to make sure are in place and be ready for this date. So we would like it to put it into the system now, but we don't want that feature to be available until, in this example, until January 1st next year. So what do? Well, we do the same as before. We create a new work item. Then we introduce an event, as we call it. That's basically just giving it a name so that we can easily change that date if things should slip at some point. We then specify the range, the time range that this pink color is available. So we basically specify that it doesn't become effective until this particular date. The other ones are effective much earlier. They're from the start of the date. Once we've done this, we validate the changes, and again, we promote to the master branch. So if we go again in the history of ACE, we see that now we have a new work item where we change the effectivity of the pink color. We can see that it has done the changes to the pink, and it also added an event to the event calendar. And we can open it up, and it will tell us that the change was that we changed the effectivity, and it used to be this crossed out date, January 1st, 2000, and now it's this new date. So it's easy to get these 2 concepts confused, because in a way you could look at effectivity as a way to do versioning as well. If you look in this picture here, I have shown that there's a rule, and it says something, and that's the rule until a certain date. And after that date, the rule says something else. And it's easy to think of this as this is the new version of the rule. But what you have to understand is that both of these rules exist in the system. They are both in there with the information that this rule applies in this time interval and this other rule applies in this other time interval. So both rules are in the system. They both exist in the same version, and they are both to be managed as separate objects. So it's not like there are two different versions of the rule. So let me try to illustrate this also with a little example. So you can imagine that we have a rule. Again, it's not important what the rule is. It has a certain content and it has a certain effectivity. So the bar here at the bottom is illustrating the time effectivity of this piece of data. And this rule is in a certain version. Now, if we change something, we'll get a new version. So what we did here now was that we basically took this rule and we split it, just like the slide before. We split it between the first version of the rule has this effectivity, and the second rule has a different effectivity, and it's also a different content. So we did an operation here where we basically copied one rule into two rules, and these two rules, we set some effectivity ranges on them that meant that they in practice are, one of them is applying at any point in time. This gives us a new version of the system. We have now two rules. These rules have a slightly different effectivity. And if we now want to change this effectivity point, might be that we would like to postpone that for a period of time, then the system will now contain yet another version. And now this version has, a different effectivity. So versioning and the effectivity are two orthogonal concepts. And both are important. Versioning, you could say, talks about older revisions. Effectivity talks about stuff that happens in the future. When you have both of these in place, it is very, very powerful that you can, because you can trace all the way back to the origin of where things came from. So what we do when we configure a product, we track or keep the version ID, and we keep the date that we used for the effectivity point. Those two are key elements to associate with the configuration that gets produced. If you have those two, you can go back in time and you can find out exactly how all the rules and all the data look like at the time where that configuration was done. So you can imagine that you do a configuration today, you use it to send a quote out, the quote gets accepted, you get an order in, you start the manufacturing of the order, and then you discover that that configuration that you produced was actually invalid, that there was a problem with it. Now, that might be many months gone from the point you did the configuration to the point where you discover the error. And the problem is that the rules and the data in the system has potentially changed a lot since then. So what we can do in ACE is that we can see that using this versioning information, we can go back and we can find out what was the release that was used to create that configuration. We can open it up and we can see all the work items that was included in that release. And we can also take, and given the versioning, we can click this button that says investigate. And what that does is that it will take the whole system back to that particular version. And it will bring the modeling environment in a state that was exactly the state it was in when this data was being released. And now you can start investigating what caused the error. You can find out what was the rules, you can debug them, analyze them, and find out, oops, this was the error. And then you can take that, and if you found out there was a problem in the rule, you can change that rule and bring that change forward in time to bring it up to date with the most recent version. So this sort of going back in time, it is very similar to sort of the time machine you might know from a Mac, where you can also see all your changes in your file system and can go back and find exactly a snapshot that corresponds to a certain point in time. So that was what I wanted to talk to you about today. It was covering these two topics of versioning and effectivity, and as I've shown, or so a few simple examples. This is something that we have built into our ACE modeling environment, and I think they are very powerful features that complement each other quite well. Because as I said, the versioning part is a lot about traceability and knowing the change path and who changed what and why. Whereas the effectivity is about the future. It's about specifying changes that will happen at some point in the future. And being able to do so also allows you to have a model that spans a long time frame. So it allows you to do what's called perpetual modeling, where you basically have one model that covers many generations of the product that just evolves over time, where you're just using effectivity to introduce and phase out features and rules that should be changing over time. So with that, I would we still have 5 minutes, so I would take any questions that people online would have.
Thank you, Henrik. I do have one question that came in while you were presenting, and that was, are the two rules coupled?
They are actually not. We have an operation in our environment to do this split, because it does happen regularly, but they are not as such coupled. They are still considered two separate rules. But we have some views that allows you to specify the effectivity range and only look at rules that are active in that range. So it can filter out other rules, but they're not as such coupled. They're two separate things. And they could also, you could have rules that have overlapping effectivity. That's quite common, actually.
Great. So I have another question here that's come in, and it says, in my perspective, versioning is more related to baselining. Somehow this is different from your understanding. So how do you look at baselines?
Yeah, so baselining, I think, is a PLM concept, or at least a different versioning concept. We don't really use that, but in a way, that's where you version each of the individual data elements. And I showed on one of the first screens sort of an A.1 or something. That's a very typical way of versioning parts and bill of materials and drawings. And their baselining basically means that you give it a name, and you remember that this name means that I have that version of that item and that version and that version. So it's sort of a way to tag, and that's also something we can do. We can give it a name, but it's basically what we do all the time with every single version. It is a global thing, not a local thing. And the baselining, as far as I understand at least, and it's more a way to give it a global designator and then specify exactly what specific version of the individual elements is in that.
Thank you. So I also have one here, and this one's very Configit specific. So is ACE an additional product, or is this part of the standard Configit CPQ? I was thinking you could maybe put some words around the differences there.
Yeah, so ACE is a rule authoring environment. It is a modeling environment. So that's where you define these configuration parameters and all the rules that are tying them together. So in that way, it is a separate application from our quoting application, our CPQ application called Quote. Those are the two offerings we have. One for defining the data, and the quoting application is consuming that data to do quotations and configure and pricing products.
So I have another one. Do we offer any other webinars that provide a walkthrough of ACE? I might be able to answer that. We do other webinars, but we haven't gone through a dedicated walkthrough of ACE yet.
Yeah, and it's not, I mean, these webinars are 30 minutes, and it's limited how much information you can cram into them. Normally a demo of ACE takes actually an hour or more, but we certainly can set up sessions on demoing ACE for those who are interested.
Great. So I have another question here that is, can you import rules to your tool in ACE? And if so, which formats are acceptable?
The short answer is yes. And we regularly import, for example, engineering rules from the PLM systems. And what we have to do there is that we will have to convert the syntax of the rules to our syntax. So there's a little bit of customization if we don't have a standard connector already in place. But we have a very rich and powerful language so we have normally no problems doing so. We also import data from SAP, from the variant configurator in SAP, and from the super bombs and build materials. So that's also a possibility. But we definitely are reading typically engineering rules from PLM systems.
All right.
And then we build a commercial layer on top, and then we combine the two and offer that as a single source of truth with respect to configuration.
Great. I've got one here that is, how do you make sure that the master is always unique, even though you have multiple users from different departments that are working on the same model?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what's meant by unique, but there is a separate process that I haven't talked about, and that is that just because data appears in master, that doesn't mean that it's the data that gets consumed by downstream systems. There's a separate step where you take the data in master and release it for specific downstream systems. And there's maybe that's a topic for another tech talk, but there's a pretty way you slice the data and you make it available for different channels. So there might be one set of data that you need for a website. You only want to show the current state of the models. As I've talked about, the models cover a long time span, potentially many years out, many models, future models. On the public website, you only want to show what you can offer today. There might be a different channel for your engineers that need to access the information to optimize their future bill of materials. So there is a process of taking the data out of master and making it available for those systems that are downstream from the configuration model. Okay. And there's some validation going on there as well. So, yeah.
I've got one last question here that I think we'll have time for today, and that is, how do you define the release process to other systems when models are altered? Yeah, so I think that's a little bit similar as what I just talked about, that you do set up a very specific release staging environment, and there's the whole runtime environment is separate. So there is a filtering and release process, and there's different ways you can trigger that. You can trigger that whenever there's a change. You can trigger it whenever every night. You can wait and not trigger it until you want to release it out once a month. That all of that is something that gets customized. Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure.